All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started today. Thank you guys for joining in. I'm so excited to have you all here. We are going to be talking about preparing for your post-military interview today. Before we get started, I do need to let you know that we will be recording today's webinar for quality assurance purposes. So I believe it asks you that when you log on here, but just so that you are aware, that will be taking place for today's webinar. My name is Taylor Sparber, and I am the STEM career coach here for career services at APUS. And I'm really excited to be here presenting on such a really great topic, really, because I know it can be a big struggle for military professionals coming out into the civilian world, trying to make sure they are, doing well and feeling prepared for their interview. So go ahead and put a thumbs up in the chat if you have an upcoming interview soon, because that's really exciting. Congratulations if you do. And if not, hey, you're taking the right steps to be prepared for when you do get that interview offer for those jobs that you've been applying for. So preparing for an interview really can be really exciting and daunting all at the same time, especially as you begin transferring out of the military, or if it's something you haven't ever done before, or it's been a really long time since you have done it. And today's presentation is going to just discuss prepare, overall some different ways and tips and tricks to prepare for that interview you guys have coming up, or hopefully soon. So here's today's agenda. We're going to go through talking about translating your military experience, research, resume review, refining your look, and then just what's actually taking place during the interview, the STAR method for answering questions in the interview, and then what to do after it, because you prepare up to the interview, you get to the interview, and there's still steps to take after the interview, and then just kind of reviewing overall key takeaways, and then we'll have some questions and answers at the end. You can go ahead if you have questions throughout, you want to drop that in the chat. I can get to that at the end, or you can wait until the end because that question might actually get answered throughout the presentation. So whatever is best for you, you can always write it down and send it in, whatever works. So we'll go ahead and we'll get into the meat of this information. So the first thing you're going to want to do is practice translating your experience. So you have your interview. Now it's time to practice, what have you been doing in the military or any other experience that you've had if, maybe you aren't solely military. Because unfortunately, not very many military employers, they don't really understand what the military entails, and which I know is not the best. But additionally, they are also unfamiliar with the various roles one may have. So military, there's all kinds of roles out there, and how that experience translates, that employer might not be able to understand it or can't really connect the dots how you could be that competitive candidate for that role. So they might not be able to extract what your character traits are, the skills or trainings that you've had to succeed in your former role, and how that experience is going to benefit them in this position and with their company compared to somebody else who is applying from a non-military background, because they might be able to better understand that. So when you go into these interviews, you want to start answering your questions in a way that's going to elaborate using stories. So figure out a story or some examples from your time in the military that can demonstrate what you did, and also display some of your character traits in that experience. So that way they can see that what you have done in the military will translate into this role. So trainings that are the most relevant, go through that job announcement, see what skills that they're really looking for, and say, okay, yes, this is exactly what I did in the military. And then come up with a way to be able to explain that to the employer in a way that they will understand that. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you can practice translating that experience. So first, you're going to want to practice talking about your military experience in non-military terms with someone who has a good understanding of the military. This can kind of help break down, is what I'm saying making sense to this person about what I've done? And then get some feedback from that professional. And then going and finding somebody with a person who doesn't really know as much about the military or really doesn't understand too much about your role, to ensure that what you're saying to them makes sense. So you can come up with a handful of questions, what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses? How will you benefit us in this position as general manager. So thinking of just some basic interviewing questions, going through and answering them, and then practicing that with somebody who isn't quite familiar with the military or, those military terms, and making sure that they understand it. And then you also want to keep in mind when preparing your responses that you're also going to be explaining your background to someone with virtually no frame of reference. So similar to what I was saying before, a lot of employers or maybe even recruiters don't have a lot of background knowledge about the military and what it entails. So you're essentially explaining what you did to somebody who just pretend doesn't even know what the military is. I mean, of course, everyone knows what the military is, but just as an example, using your imagination, they don't know. So you got to explain it as if they have no clue. So here's an example of translating your military experience. So here's a military wording example. Led a 12-person combat team through 4 successful missions. To an employer, that might sound very intimidating, or they're like, I have no idea what this means. You might even sound overqualified or not qualified at all, depending on what the position is. Whereas the non-military wording, so here this kind of puts it in more perspective. Managed a 12-person team in a fast-paced environment while meeting top 5 organizational goals. So rewording that in a way that's going to make sense for somebody in the civilian to understand what you did. So it doesn't talk about, a combat team, but it does talk about that you had to manage those 12 people. So it's figuring out the right terms in a way that's going to correspond to what you did to what somebody in the civilian sector would be able to understand. So before the interview, you're going to want to take time to do some research. And I can't stress this one enough, because the more you know about a company or a role, the more comfortable you're going to feel going into that interview, because you're going to be able to bring up points about saying, oh, I noticed this on the website, or, oh, I connected with this person on LinkedIn and this is some information they gave me, or I noticed this in the job announcement and this is kind of where I fall into that role. And it just allows you to elaborate on some different stories or your background experience. So overall, just making you feel more comfortable. And it also allows you to take some time to think about your standards, and determine if your standards are in alignment with that company. So that job role might sound amazing, but then you go through and you kind of read and you might say, this doesn't necessarily align with where I want to be as a professional, or where I see myself going as a professional. So it allows you to give you a little bit more of an idea of what you're walking into. So to start really learning about the organization, you can utilize like a company website and identify its mission, vision, and values. Usually that's, in the About Us section. And who does this company serve? Learn a little bit more about the population it serves. How does this company align with your professional views, and tying that information you have found into your answer, because this tells the employer, you are prepared, you're organized, and you're committed to learning more, that you've done your research, that you're not just someone there interviewing, you're someone who is going to be dedicated to working for this company that truly wants this position, not just someone showing up. And so as you deep dive into learning more about the organization and what they're seeking and the type of people that work there, you can review your qualifications for the job and the desired qualifications of the role, and learning, how does all this work together. And with this, so when you're reviewing your qualifications for the job and the desired qualifications for the role, you can try to highlight your skills as close to the requirements as possible, because employers want to know that your skills are a direct fit for their position. So if you see they want management, like if it is a management job, say you're becoming a manager or that's what you're applying for, they want to know how you've led people. What projects have you managed? Have you started anything on your own? Have you taken that initiative? So those kind of things, and thinking like, okay, let's reevaluate what I have done. Let's evaluate what this company is looking for. Where are they moving towards? Because you can say this is a new company or newer company, but you have experience in the military starting up a new initiative or new program. You're really going to want to tie that in, because if you have experience starting up something new or a new type of program, and this is kind of what this position is doing, then of course that's going to go hand in hand. So you really want to highlight that. And the only way you're going to learn about that is if you do your research, because you're not going to know if it's a newer company unless you're researching it. And then also tailors what your answer is to that direct position to highlight your skills and experience. And then you want to get comfortable explaining and translating how your military experience would relate to the job. Just what I was talking about in the previous slide. And a good resource to use, and I can drop this in the link later, is military.com. They have a skill translator option to kind of help articulate how your MOS can be applied to a post-military job. It can give you some different types of skills that might be translatable. So that way it can give you more information to help you with researching, how your military job could relate to the civilian role. Oh, I want to apologize. I believe that this was out of order. I am so sorry about that. Okay. Um, all right. So the next thing is knowing your resume. So learning about the company and future role, it is essential, but do you know your resume? And you might say, of course I know my resume. I'm the one who wrote it. Well, that's great, but when I say this, it's looking through and thinking, do I need to demilitarize my resume? Not saying that your military experience isn't amazing, because I know it's amazing. You guys are doing great things. You're serving your country. But what I mean by this is taking the time to read through your resume and to be able to be ready to answer these questions that you're going to get from employers, and knowing what you have on your resume and how it's directly related to that job position. And some ways you can do this is making sure, like when you read through, when I say this, it's is the information on your resume understandable by that employer? Do they know what you've done? And you want them to know what you've done, because that's how you got to the interview. Or maybe you haven't quite gotten that interview yet, and you're trying to get that interview, but maybe your resume has too many military terms on it, or too many military examples that doesn't quite translate to that civilian experience. So it's really important to go through to make sure you are translating your skills on the resume, as well as when you're in person as well. And this can also help by knowing your resume. You're in that interview, and the employer's still trying to gain a better understanding of what you've done. You can point to different bullet points and say, you've asked me this question. Right here's a really great example of how I've demonstrated that experience, or demonstrated that skill that you're seeking. And then you can elaborate off that bullet point into that story to give them some background knowledge. So if you're not really sure about your resume, say you've put out some different resumes that you've tailored, you might not be able to quickly point out, like, hey, right here, it says it right here on this resume. Or you might not be able to elaborate because you're not really sure which one that you gave. So really understanding what's on your resume is going to be essential before walking into that interview. And then being prepared to talk about your accomplishments that appear on your resume, and ones that do not. So in the military, I know there's a lot of opportunities for promotions and accomplishments, and they are all wonderful, but you don't want to list all of those on the resume. If you want to list some, that's great, that's acceptable, but I recommend listing 1 to 3 of your top accomplishments that could be most translatable to the job role you're seeking. And then once you get in that interview, you can say, yes, I have proven experience. I was awarded X, Y, and Z for doing this duty or this mission or whatever it is that you've done. So you can always elaborate on that in the interview as well. And you can always think back on your previous positions. It doesn't have to be current. It could be something that happened 5 years ago, and then shown how you've grown from that. So really knowing your resume to market yourself and elaborate on it when you're in that interview. Okay, first impressions are everything. So out of this whole PowerPoint, understanding your resume, translating your skills, this is going to be the next most important thing that you take away from this webinar, if anything, is refining your look. And this might sound really basic about what I'm about to tell you, but it's not, because I've had so many military students come to me saying, what do I wear? What do I say? What do I look like? And because you have your uniform, you have your main dress code about the hair length, if you're clean shaven or not clean shaven. So like this can be very different coming out of the military into that civilian interview experience. So first impressions are everything. You want to leave a positive, lasting impression, so try to look your best. This is the day that you want to look your most professional. And it also, not only does it look great for making that first impression, you're not going to, give them that, oh, wow factor. They're clean, they look nice, they smell nice. But it's also giving you that confidence of, I got this. I feel good about myself. I look good. I'm prepared. And that's going to really shine in that interview, that you are confident and that you are prepared. So when I say refining your look, have good hygiene. Your hair should look nice, fresh breath, and avoid too much cologne or too much perfume, because some people can be sensitive to that. And if they're distracted by the way you smell, then that might not, they might not retain the information or gather that information like they would if you didn't have as much on. And not saying you shouldn't wear it, but just watch how much you spray on there on yourself, because that could be distracting. Clean shaven or a freshly trimmed beard, that's very acceptable. Not looking too scruffy, but you also still want to look like yourself as well, because you don't want to give them like a false sense of who you are. But just cleaning yourself up just a little bit to make that good first impression. The next thing is dressing appropriately. So this does not include your military attire. And it's best to avoid it if you can. So wearing a nice suit or a dress shirt, dress pants, slacks. For women, blouse, skirt, dress. So matching kind of and this is another way that research helps, is seeing, what are the employees wearing? So like if you're interviewing for a law firm, you're definitely going to want to look more dressed up than maybe, I know this is totally a different example, but then working at Target. Target, you don't need to be on a full-on suit like you would need to be applying at a law firm. So knowing your company can also help you decide how dressed up you might want to be to make yourself feel more comfortable, so you're not feeling overdressed when you're in the interview or underdressed. And really, when you get into that interview, it should feel more like a conversation. You want to show your personality in that interview. I've had several military professional students that I've worked with say, I'm scared they're going to be intimidated by me, or I'm not sure how they're going to perceive me in my role because of my background experience. So it's really important to remain professional, but avoid that by the book facade, or I believe military professionals are taught to maintain their bearing, if I've understood that correctly throughout the years. This is usually when with promotion boards and similar events. So you really want to show who you are. So that way the employer can engage how you are going to fit with their team. So it's not just about answering questions, it's about making sure you're a good personality match. And what your personality can bring to the team, or how it could, on the other side, it might impede it if, like, you do have that stone look on your face versus, a little bit more friendly, interactive with them. So making sure you give a little bit of personality in an interview is going to be really important as well. And it's also knowing your company, knowing the position you're applying for. If you are going to be someone who's out in the community for a nonprofit, for like human, like raising funds for human services or something, then you might want a little bit more of a bubbly personality. Or like a law firm, you want to have a way that you can show that you're connectable and relatable, but you might not be as vibrant. So just really knowing the position you're applying for is going to be a great way to show your personality as well in the most appropriate way. And then arriving on time. So this is going to be a really important as well. So you don't want to arrive too early, but you also don't want to be arriving right on time. I mean, it's important to be right on time. Definitely you definitely don't want to be late. So the happy medium I kind of recommend is I suggest arriving 5 to 10 minutes before the interview. So this gives you time if you run into any traffic or you get lost, you might not be able to find the building. So that way it just gives you a little of that extra comfort zone to get there on time. And it shows the employer that you know how to time manage and that you're reliable. So that way you're not too early, not showing any type of desperation, but you're not late. And sometimes things happen. So around here, 81, we have I-81, there's car accidents all the time, and you can be stuck in it for hours. So things sometimes are out of your control when it comes to that, but you're trying to leave in enough time or being in that general area to show up within 5 to 10 minutes before the interview. Gives you time to breathe a little bit and get settled. feel more comfortable in your environment. You want to turn off your cell phone or at least have it on do not disturb. I know we're all busy professionals. I'm sure a lot of us are parents. So turning off the phone might not be an option, but you don't want to be interrupted during the call. During the interview, because this can cause disruption and distraction during the interview. And you want to make sure that you're giving that interviewer all of your time and that you're showing them that this is a priority for you in your life and that this is the company that you want to work for in that position. And then greeting the interviewer. So have it with the interviewer, you usually, as long as they extend your hand for a nice firm handshake, not so hard that it hurts their hand, but not super soft, a nice confident handshake too. And while you're doing this, you can gather all the interviewer's information, like their names, to build rapport. So there may be one, okay, that's great. Hi, my name is Taylor. It's nice to meet you. Or there could be two. Hi, my name is Taylor. It's nice to meet you. And then you go to the next one and their name might be Steve and then or Becky. And make sure you're gathering their names and introducing yourself to them as well. And this can make it more comfortable once you're in the interview because then you can speak to them by name, especially if someone brings up something personal about themselves during the interview, like, oh yeah, I've had that experience. And then you can say, oh yeah, Becky, this is kind of similar to what you experienced and here's what I've done in that role that's similar to what you've done. So that makes it more personable, like you can build that rapport with them. And then once you're in that interview in your room, you're going to want to get comfortable, not too comfortable. You don't want to be slouching. You don't want your arms crossed or anything like that. You want to maintain that good body posture. Avoid looking too stiff and uncomfortable because they're going to notice that. You want to, again, show that confidence in yourself. Make eye contact when you're speaking to them, as that also shows professionalism and that self-confidence. And then when you're in that interview, active listening is going to be crucial. Listen carefully to the questions that the interviewer are asking and let them finish. I have done several mock interviews with students who don't even let me finish questions that are asked. They just go ahead and answer because they have it ready to go. Well, that's great. It's great that you're that prepared. I encourage you to feel that prepared and that confident, but you have to let that person finish speaking. One, that's out of respect, and two, they might have something additional that they want to ask on top of the question that you think is being asked, and you might not answer it correctly. And then that also shows if you're not willing to let them finish speaking, it does show a little bit about your character and who you are in more of a negative light than a positive. So this, just sit there, take some time, hear what they're saying, process what they're saying, and then give your answer. Now, it's okay. So say you really are listening, you're active listening, but the question still isn't quite clear to you. That's okay. You can ask for clarification. Do you mind repeating that question? Or, I gather that you would like me to answer this part, but could you better explain what you're looking what you're looking for with this part of the question? Or just, can you please repeat that question again so I can ensure I give you the most appropriate answer or a best appropriate situational answer kind of thing. So different ways to word that, and it's absolutely okay to ask that. And in fact, I know I've done it a couple of times in interviews that when I've done this, the interviewer actually appreciates me asking because they can see that I truly want to give them the best information and knowledge I have about myself to show them why I'm that competitive candidate. So I encourage you to do that as well when you are on your interviewing journey. So now we're talking about answering these questions. The STAR method is the method I recommend utilizing. There's a lot of great information out there on the STAR method, and this helps answer questions. So the STAR stands for situation, task, action, and result. And using this method can be really helpful in framing and responding to the questions that are being asked. So for this example, usually using STAR can help with when an employer says, describe a time when, or share an example of a situation where, and that allows you to further elaborate. So we're going to start with a situation as an example, and this situation is where you describe the event or circumstance that you were in. So for example, I demonstrated excellent organizational skills through my experience working as a paralegal. And then so that's your situation. And then your task is you're going to describe that. You're going to describe the task you completed or the role and responsibility or what your role and responsibility was for that task. So while in this position, I was tasked with helping our lawyers prepare for trial. And then after that, you're going to go with that action. So the action comes next. This is where you really want to be specific, especially if you can pinpoint hard skills found in the job announcement. So like if you used any type of technology or if you speak another language, if there's any, I know I'm thinking of environmental science with GIS mapping, like if there is something specific that you have, that hard skill knowledge, not communication or teamwork, nothing like that, those are soft skills, then you'll want to highlight that, and they will put that stuff in that job announcement. But for the example, for the action step, I scheduled over 30 appointments a day, managed the Outlook calendar, and maintained the order of the filing system by using e-file cabinet software. So let's just say, so e-file cabinet software, that would have been a hard skill that was potentially listed on the resume, and maybe even Outlook calendar, because there's different, there's other platforms out there like Google. So if you want to get specific, depending on what is on that job announcement and you have experience using it, you definitely want to elaborate on it that way. And then lastly, the results for the STAR method. So you want to close using a specific example with the results of your efforts. So it may be helpful to emphasize what you've accomplished or what you've learned. So for example, my organizational skills ensured that lawyers were successfully prepared for their court appearances. So having that accomplishment, what did you do, how did you do it, and what did you accomplish? That's a good outline for your resume. It's a good outline when it comes to answering those questions in the interview. Because it's great that you know how to do it, but what did you accomplish doing it? How did you accomplish doing it? How did we get here? And when you're specific like that, you're giving that employer that full visualization of what you're capable of, because even though you're saying this, there might be something in between the lines that they see or hear where they're like, that would be great for us. Like you might not even know that you're answering a whole other question that they have. So being as specific and relatable as possible. And this is when your research can come in handy when using the STAR method, because you will have, I recommend having several stories ready to provide the employer. Try to identify events where you could use it for multiple scenarios. So like, you might have a story or two that could answer a few different types of questions, which is great because you're not always going to be sure about what they're going to ask. So having a story that might demonstrate your leadership, your communication skills, your organizational skills, a story all in one. That way you can pinpoint parts of that story to elaborate on. But you always want to make sure your story is aligned with the position that you're applying for, because this is going to make it tailored to, that way you're tailoring your answer to the questions and to that specific role and how your past experience has prepared you for this role that you're entering. All right, so we've made it preparing for the interview, we've made it during the interview, and now we are after the interview. There's 4 steps that I recommend taking. So after the interview, the first thing I recommend doing is sending a thank you email to the hiring manager and any additional interviewers within the first 24 hours of the interview. And kind of backtracking real quick, during the interview, if you can get their contact information, such as their email, that would be advisable, because emails aren't always necessarily put on the job announcement, or they're not always on a website. So it may be harder to get to send that thank you interview email. If they're willing to give it. If it's not, it's okay. You can always email it to their HR representatives and say, hey, do you mind forwarding this to Becky? So say Becky's the hiring manager. That way they can get that message across to that person, or say, I had a recent interview. Can you please forward along my thank you email to whoever was a part of that that interview. And in this thank you email, you're thanking the interviewer for their time. Mention, this is going to be part of the reflecting part on piece number 2, mentioning a specific point you both spoke about. So if there was something that really helped you engage in conversation with the employer, mentioning that, or if there was a skill or experience where the employer was like, oh, that would be great for a position like this, reiterate that, give them that reminder of, hey, I'm bringing this to the table, and then convey your interest in the job opportunity. And it's something to remember, like, you are going in for that interview, you are being interviewed for that position, but you are also interviewing the employer at the same time. because you need to make sure this is a good fit for you, and make sure that company is a good fit for you. Make sure that manager, that hiring that supervisor is going to be a good fit for you. So as long as you're still interested in that position, you can say, I am excited to move forward with the interviewing process for this, and provide the specific job. So convey your interest in the job opportunity. So to put that all back together again, when thanking the employer, you want to thank them for their time, mention a specific point that you both touched base on, and then still convey your interest in the job opportunity. If you're not so interested in it, that's okay. You can still thank them for their time, because there might be an opportunity down the road that opens up that you're like, this would be perfect for me. I did enjoy the interview. Like, I enjoyed, not the interview, but I enjoyed who I connected with. I could see myself working here, but maybe not in this role. But so you don't want to burn any bridges, keeping your network open to possibilities. So always thanking them, even if you're not interested, and you don't have to say that. You can just thank them for their time and look forward to connecting in the future or something like that along those lines. And then after the interview, reflect and write down some key points from the interview. So interviews are always a learning process, and this information can be helpful. One, to reflect on moving forward on how you could do better or what you did good at, and to remember to do that going forward. This is also helpful for that second interview that you may get. So sometimes it's not always the first interview. You may have up to 3 or 4 interviews depending on the job role that you're applying for, or you might just have 2 interviews. I think for my position here, I had 3 interviews. So always taking note about information, and make sure you specify, like, if you are going on multiple interviews, I recommend writing the job title, the company, so that way you're not giving different information in different interviews. So putting down some different points that were discussed, what the employer is looking for, that kind of thing, so that way when you pick up where you left off, you can say, oh yeah, I remember, or you mentioned doing this for this role. I want to learn more, explore more about that. So that way you are building that interest and making that connection. And just as a good reminder when you're preparing for that next go around. And then with that, reflecting on your interviewing skills, which is I touched base on, what went well, what could you improve on, and just begin practicing. And then after the interview, be sure to identify a timeline to help. So when you've ended the interview, before you leave, similar to gathering their information, you want to try to identify a timeline of next steps. You can say, after you've asked your questions, or, maybe it's your last question, saying, this job is still of interest to me. I'm curious, what are the next steps for your interviewing process? And from there, the employer will say something along the lines of, we have a few more interviews this week, or a few more today, and then by the end of next week, we will reach out for a second interview. If we decide to move forward with you and your candidacy, or they could say this, if this is the only one, you can expect to hear an answer by next week, or in 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And then after that, here's the next steps onto the onboarding process. So because if you find out the timeline of this interview process, it will avoid from you wanting to email them often asking for a check-in. And when you start, checking in too much, it could, hinder that opportunity. You want to do just enough, follow up right after within 24 hours. If you didn't get the timeline, or if you got to get the timeline, that's okay. You can follow up a week later and say, hey, just wanted to touch base after the interview. It was really a pleasure meeting with you. I was just hoping to gather some insight on next steps for the interviewing process. So I recommend giving it about a week to follow up after you've sent that initial thank you email, just to give it time in the event that you didn't get the next steps, because that's okay. It happens. We get excited, we get into it, and sometimes that question we forget to ask. But if you have that in-person interview, or even if you're doing it virtually, those are part of the questions I recommend writing down towards the end of your list. It's acceptable to take notes, as long if you're virtual, making sure the person knows, like, hey, I'm taking some notes, do you mind? Which they shouldn't mind, but it's good to let them know so they don't think you're just looking down. And if you're in person, they can clearly see that you're taking notes, and that will probably help, not, I can't say help you get the job, but it's going to help you look more prepared and interested in making sure that you are detail oriented. So it's not a bad thing to have those prepared questions with you. And then some just key takeaways from the rest of the presentation. So the first thing to do is to practice translating those skills. So we first talked about translating, what you bring to the table into non-military terms. So focus on translating your military skills and experience in a way that non-military professionals can understand so they can identify how you are best fit for the position. And then number 2, research. Take that time to research and prepare for the interview in advance. We offer mock interviews here in Career Services, which are free, and it's a great way to help you prepare. So if you have that job announcement, feel free to send that in with, to your career coach that you end up working with, and then they can gain a better understanding what you're doing and then help you better practice for your interview coming up. And then review your resume. So find ways to showcase your relevant accomplishments and skills on your resume, whether it's, when you're practicing going through it, highlighting some information you hope to point out to the employer or how it ties into a story that you're going to tell. And then, coming up with some questions for like your answers using the STAR method, not questions, your answers using that STAR method. And then follow up and remain patient. So remember to send that thank you message after you have had your interview. And then the hardest part is remaining patient to hear those next steps, or if you got the job, because you don't want to follow up too much, as it could possibly hinder your chances of getting the position. All right. So, and then the best way to contact Career Services is by filling out a form on your eCampus. If you're looking for career coaching, mock interviews, there's a form for that. We also offer free resume reviews. So if you are looking to have your resume reviewed, feel free to send it in. We can help with suggestions on formatting, content, grammar, things like that. And if you have a resume, we can help guide you better on tailoring it by asking some different questions. So we're happy to help you with building a strong resume. And then if you don't do the form, you can always email us at careerservices@apus.edu, and we're happy to help. And then you can always call in as well. We do coaching appointments one-on-one, so it's always best that, you'll get more time with us by setting up the appointment to better have prepared discussions on both ends. So that's what we really encourage, and that would be by filling out a form or giving us an email. So that is the conclusion for today's presentation, our webinar.